George, and today's Bible study is going to be on Matthew chapter 16, verses 21 through 24, and Matthew 10 and 38. We're going to talk about carrying your cross. I'm reading from the Revised Standard Version, which is actually a really great version to have because it isn't very hard to read. It's very understandable, very easy to read. Even the format, it's not in the regular chapter and verse sort of format. It's actually in a paragraphical format, which is really great. It's easier to read. It's easier to understand. I think everyone should have a sort of down-to-earth version like this. Other good versions are the Message Bible, the English Standard Version, the NLT, New Living Translation. Really good versions. But today I'm going to be reading out of the Revised Standard Version. Again, Matthew chapter 16, verses 21 through 24. That's the beginning text. And I'm going to read it. You can read along if you like. Verse 21. From that time, Jesus began to show his disciples that he must go to Jerusalem and suffer many things from the elders and chief priests and scribes and be killed and be raised up on the third day. Peter took Jesus aside and began to rebuke him, saying, God forbid it, Lord. This shall never happen to you. But then Jesus turned and said to Peter, Get behind me, Satan. You are a stumbling block to me, for you are not setting your mind on God's interest, but man. And verse 24, Then Jesus said to his disciples, If anyone wishes to come after me, he must deny himself and take up his cross and follow me. Again, this is entitled Taking Up Your Cross and Following After Jesus. We find in this text that Peter has just encountered kind of a serious problem. If you read a few verses above what I just read, we find that Jesus has called the disciples together and he said, Who do men say that I am? And the disciples went through a bunch of replies, and they went through a few answers. And Jesus said, Well, who do you say that I am? And the disciples really couldn't say much. But Peter said, You are the Christ, the Son of the living God, who was to come into the world. So at this, Jesus' messiahship, the fact that Jesus is the Christ, is revealed to them. Jesus says, Flesh and blood did not reveal this to you. And at that point, Jesus goes on to tell them what he has to do. He's pretty much where I start reading is where he's saying, well, since you know that I'm the Messiah now, I'm going to have to tell you what I have to go through and how I can fulfill my role as the Messiah. I have to go to Jerusalem. I have to be handed to the elders and the chief priests and the scribes. I have to die. And on the third day, I will rise again. Well, Peter has a problem with this. The Bible says in verse 22, Peter takes Jesus aside and starts saying, You know, Lord, this can't happen to you. Don't let it happen to you. This will never be. This will never be. And a lot of people I've read and heard different sermons about this same text, and people often say, oh, Peter was really in love with the Lord, and Peter just didn't want anything bad to happen to him. And I'm not saying that's false entirely. But what I will say is this. Jesus has said in previous verses that a servant is no greater than the master. And he kept kind of building on this same platform that if I go through things, then you're going to go through things. And if they rejected me in the world, then they'll reject you in the world. And he kind of built this sort of stage that said, if I go through something, you're going to go through it too. Peter realizes this. So if Jesus says, I'm going to be handed over to the chief priests, I'm going to be persecuted, I'm going to be murdered brutally, and this is how I fulfill my role, and you're supposed to follow my example. Peter kind of has a revelation. Peter's in a really revelatory state right now. He's just picking up things left and right. Just like he could pick up that Jesus is the Christ, he could pick up that if Jesus the Christ is going to be persecuted and murdered in his physical body, then that means that his followers are going to have to go through the same thing. And he was very, very frightened at that. I can imagine. I'm sure he was. To me, as an African-American female, it would be the same thing as Jesus stepping into 1950s United States of America South and saying, hey, I'm about to get lynched, and what I need you to do is, if men come against you, hand them the rope to lynch you too. I would be petrified, absolutely petrified. And Peter had this same sort of feeling. Oh my gosh, if Jesus is going to go through this, then that means most likely I'm going to go through this or something similar. So he starts saying, God forbid it, it's not going to happen to you, don't worry about it, don't say that, Jesus. Partly because Peter's concerned for Jesus. But Peter has the revelation that Jesus is the Christ. He is the eternal Messiah. So he knows that this sort of thing won't faze him if he allows it to happen to him. His main concern is for Peter at this point. And Jesus says in verse 23, says, he turned and said to Peter, get behind me, Satan. You are a stumbling block to me because you keep man's interest in mind as opposed to God's interest. Peter was after his interest. He was after a man's interest. He was thinking, hey, two things. One, I want Jesus to stay around longer. And two, I know for a fact I don't want to go through this. He wasn't thinking about God's plan of salvation. He wasn't thinking about Jesus' place in God's main scope of things. God had created a big picture. Jesus was playing a part, and he was saying, I have to fulfill my part in order for the whole picture to look correct. And Peter wasn't having it. Peter was not having it. And so in verse 24, we find Jesus kind of turns the shift off of Peter. Because a lot of people, when they go over this text, they say, oh, Jesus was rebuking Peter and calling him Satan. No, he was not calling him Satan. He was calling his motive satanic. Because anytime you put your focus on what is more important to you as opposed to what is important to God, then you are operating in the satanic. Anytime as a believer I put my needs or my wants or my desires before God's needs, wants, and desires, I am operating against God's will. And another way of putting that is I'm operating in the satanic. That is why the Bible says rebellion is as the sin of witchcraft. Rebellion against God means I'm taking it into my own hands and I'm stripping it out of God's hands. God is no longer sovereign. Now I'm in control. And that's that's operating in satanic. That is 100% operating in the satanic. So Jesus is rebuking Peter, saying you're operating in the satanic because you are looking after man's interests as opposed to God's interests. So in verse 24, we find Jesus kind of turns the focus away from Peter. And he looks at all the disciples. And he says, let me make one thing perfectly clear. He says, if anyone wishes to come after me, and I've read this in a bunch of translations, and most of the translations read, if anyone wants to be my disciple. So he's saying, if anyone wants to come after me, and if anyone wants to be my disciple, 3 requirements are required. He has to, 1, deny himself. He has to, 2, take up his cross. And he has to, number 1, follow me. Follow Jesus where? Well, let's backtrack. I think I'm getting a little ahead of myself. First thing is first. He said, deny yourself. You have to deny yourself. And what we find in this text is that he's pretty much talking about, when you do a Greek breakdown of everything, we find that Jesus is saying that you are to give your self-interest a back seat. Pretty much is what he's saying. You are to give your self-interest a back seat to God. He's saying that if I want a burger and the Lord's saying fast, I'm going to have to put that burger on hold. I can't have a burger right now. And I'm making this really simplified and very oversimplified because I think that that's the best way to relate it. And I feel like it's something that we are often faced with. I know I am. Simple decisions. It's the little foxes that spoil the vine. Sometimes God isn't saying, you have to choose this mountain or that mountain. Sometimes he's saying, choose this flower or that flower. Very simple things. And so in those decisions, we have to deny ourselves. Our first decision, our first main priority, the main factor in our decision-making process should not be how we feel. Should not be how I feel. Should not be how I would react or how this will affect me or my feelings or my desires. My main priority in decision-making should be, is this the will of God for me?